It is the fantasy football dumpster darlings after week 7 in the National Football League. So again, every week we run through and see the top performances from the least owned players, and this one takes the cake, I think, in terms of the least owned quotient that we have here. Just going to, yeah, okay, that's around what I thought. So, Mini Moneymaker, I see the note in the chat. We'll get to it in a second. Let's run through the dumpster darlings out of week 7. At quarterback, at 7% owned, it is Russell Wilson. 24.86 fantasy points. Didn't even look all that good, but he was one of the top performers of the quarterback spot this week. At wide receiver, Rashad Bateman, 16% owned, comes up with a big night on Monday Night Football at 20.1 fantasy points. He was 16% owned, which is 16% more than Cedric Wilson, who came up with 14.7 fantasy points in a huge performance for this one. Also at 0% owned, Jamichael Hasty, 13.2 points out in England. Our running back number 2, Justice Hill, still 18% owned after a big open to the season, but 12.3 fantasy points. At tight end, it's Jonnu Smith, 4% owned, 19.1 fantasy points. Cedric Tillman, who we talked about before as a potential waiver wire addition, he plays for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's owned in 0% of leagues. 14.1 fantasy points. So we have 3 players on this list. 0% owned, 14.7, 13.2, 14.1. Will Lutz is the kicker at 6% owned, 18 fantasy points. And your defense for the dumpster darlings this week, the Seattle Seahawks, 17% owned, 16 fantasy points. All told, this team with a combined owned percentage of 68% comes up with 152.36 fantasy points. Just absurd what is out there every week, and just shows how much of a crapshoot all of this stuff really is. Back into the chat, Mini Moneymaker. I'm trying to trade for Jamar Chase. Will Cup and Mason get the job done? He needs a wide receiver with JT and Etienne being out. His wide receiver 2 is also Mooney. Yeah, I think that should get you pretty close there, for sure. I think that with Cup, especially now that Cup is coming back and there being a lot of excitement around that player, I think that should get you pretty close to a Jamar Chase. And then with Mason coming over the top, and considering the desperation at running back, not just like Taylor being out for the last little bit has probably made him desperate, but since Etienne has been out, Bigsby has kind of felt like the big dude now out there, pardon the pun. And so even with Etienne on his way back, Bigsby still feels like at the very least he's cutting into those opportunities quite drastically. So I think that you're going to get a little bit of desperation from that owner, and I think that they are going to view the step down from Chase to Cup to not be significant enough to pass up the opportunity to add to your running back depth, at least for a little bit, while CMC is still out on the shelf. So I think that is a pretty smart move, quite frankly, and I think one that would definitely benefit you moving forward. So I think, you know what? I think they would go for it, and I think you should go for it as well. All right, that is it for the scheduled portion of the fantasy football chat. If you guys want to or have any other fantasy football thoughts, throw them in there. I am going to move on to other things, but I can always bounce back to them once those segments are done. So that is what's going on here in the chat.